Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for choosing this session. My name's Alison Marcelle. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and thank them for hosting us. I also acknowledge that people of African descent have been in Nova Scotia for over 400 years, and we honor and offer gratitude to those ancestors who came before us to this land. We have 3 presentations today. I'm going to do all of your bios at one time, and then we'll just let you. Okay, great. So to start, we have Marianne Martin. Marianne is a postdoctoral researcher with the Research for Social Change Lab at Trent University and is an instructor with Trent's Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems program. Her research interests include household food insecurity, social divisions of caring labor, and the impacts that policy responses to material deprivation have on people's day-to-day lives. Next, we have, Next, we have Carrie Rempel. Carrie is a community researcher based out of the Okanagan College in Kelowna, BC. Over the past 10 years, her work has been focused on bridging academic research and community action. Her current work focuses on 2 areas: the inclusion of lived experience voices in addressing homelessness and understanding how to address homelessness from a field, multi-system perspective. Carrie is currently finishing her PhD studies at UBC Okanagan while teaching in the Okanagan School of Business. And last but not least, we have Violetta Peters. Violetta is a 4th-year doctoral candidate in the Faculty of Health Studies at Ontario Tech U. Her dissertation research focuses on aging and homelessness. She's also an experienced, supportive housing leader who utilized strategic leadership, collaboration, and innovation to develop new housing support solutions for populations experiencing homelessness. Her strong commitment to evidence-informed practice is depicted in collaborative research projects she undertakes, including investigating the supportive housing needs of women who use substances in the evaluation of community hub pilots for vulnerable populations. Violetta is a MyTax Accelerate PhD Fellow and an International Foundation of Integrated Care awardee. So each presenter will get 20 minutes. I'm going to show you when you have 10, 5, and 2. And then I'm going to use the Bugs Bunny cane and pull you off if you go over that. And then we'll have 30 minutes for questions. The more questions we have, the less drinking we can do at the reception. We're going to go 15 minutes into the reception time so that everyone can have their questions asked and answered. I will hand it over.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. All right. So welcome to everyone who's joining us here in person or online. This presentation was developed by Sam Blundow, Naomi Nichols, and myself through the Research for Social Change Lab at Trent University. Unfortunately, Sam and Naomi could not be here to co-present with me today. I'm going to talk with you about the response to homelessness in Peterborough, Nogo-Jiwanong, Ontario, the research that our team did on this response, and particularly the parts of it that form coordinated access. To start off, I'll tell you a bit about homelessness in Peterborough. The city of Peterborough reports about 300 people living in homelessness each month, about half of whom are chronically homeless. The most recently available numbers are from December 2022, and the most recent point-in-time count showed a 350% increase from 2018 to 2021 of people living outside, and a 45% increase in people who were chronically homeless. Up until recently, the city of Peterborough was funding 4 shelters for people experiencing homelessness, and in 2019, it became one of the first communities in the country to adopt the coordinated access model for addressing homelessness. So I'll just tell you a little bit about coordinated access, which you might already know about. In 2019, the Government of Canada ratified the right to housing in the National Housing Strategy Act. But the provinces and territories have no specific obligations under this act vis-a-vis the right to housing. And no province or territory in Canada has recognized housing as a fundamental human right. In other words, although the Government of Canada has enacted a federal homelessness strategy, it doesn't fully fund it, nor is it responsible for its implementation. In this context, the potential for variation across the local level is managed by the federal government through the National Housing Strategy and the Reaching Home program, the latter of which governs the distribution of funding required to deliver services at the municipal level. To enable compliance with the federal strategy in this context, Reaching Home requires that to receive funds, all designated communities must first implement a homelessness management information system, and second, implement a coordinated access system defined by the following steps: access, assessment, prioritization, and matching and referral. Additionally, all service managers in Ontario, like the City of Peterborough, are required to maintain a by-name list of people experiencing homelessness. The by-name list is framed as the source of real-time data through which the prioritization, matching, and referral process is accomplished. So our research emerged in 2021 in response to the tensions that our team witnessed in Peterborough. The team saw service providers expressing concern about how coordinated access was being operationalized. For example, the administration of the homelessness system and social assistance system by a single government entity subjected people living in poverty to increased state surveillance. In our lab, researchers with lived and living knowledge of the local homelessness system questioned whether coordinated access truly served as an efficient way to connect people to housing, given their own participation in the coordinated system and their experiences of episodic or chronic homelessness. The team saw that there was also a breakdown in collaboration among service providers. Team members were concerned for the lives of friends and loved ones who were homeless, and were finding that some people that they knew were still living on the streets after many years. In addition, people didn't seem to understand how or why the system designed to help people get housed was working. And everyone could see the growing numbers of people living in encampments throughout our local community since 2019. People for whom coordinated access appeared not to be working as a viable route to housing. The adoption of coordinated systems such as coordinated access as a required component of a municipal homelessness response in Canada is also of interest to us because, as John Ecker and his colleagues have determined, despite their ambitious objectives and widespread implementation, the evidence base for coordinated systems is limited. So this research developed out of concern, compassion, and curiosity about a system that seemed not to be working. In response to these concerns, the team set out to learn as much as it could about the local homelessness response, including coordinated access, and how the system is designed for people to become housed. In this first phase, the team created a guidebook for service providers and people without housing to use to understand how the system is designed to work. This was intended to improve the transparency and navigability of the housing process for both service users and service providers. The purpose of the second phase, the results of which are the focus of this talk, was to assess whether the homelessness response, including coordinated access, was functioning as designed in our community. In this phase, we aimed to assess each of the 4 steps of the coordinated access process from the perspectives of people who are closest to it. So we conducted a listening exercise through interviews with 42 social service professionals and municipal government employees, and 48 people with experience of homelessness in Peterborough. We also reviewed local by-name list data and conducted an online survey with service providers to identify their priority actions for addressing local homelessness. The research was not designed as a formal evaluation of coordinated access. Rather, it was designed to help local decision makers understand the persistent number of people experiencing homelessness, despite this community being an early adopter of coordinated access. Since completing the research, we've been working with the community to put our findings into practice so as to improve the efficacy and ethics of the local homelessness response. So now I'll go through our findings for the 4 stages of coordinated access. First stage is access. Our research found common community access points are not accessible to everyone in housing need, especially given that many of those without housing in our community are not using local shelters, which make up many of the local access points. We found that emergency shelters are inaccessible to people in our community who have physical and/or neurodevelopmental disabilities, are substance dependent, transgendered or gender non-binary, have experienced gender-based and sexual violence in a shelter, and/or do not want to be separated from a loved one or a pet. For these reasons, the shelters do not serve as accessible points of entry to all those in housing need. Furthermore, interviews with people who engage with coordinated access as service users suggest that the existing access points do not make the system easier to understand or to navigate. In fact, most of the homeless individuals whom we interviewed, so 33 out of 48, didn't understand the coordinated access process, nor the importance of the by name list. Excuse me. The second stage is assessment. So all designated communities are required to have a standardized assessment process. Peterborough uses the VI SPDAT and SPDAT tools. Assessment is a key consideration in prioritization, and it drives matching and referral. Unfortunately, frequent staff turnover in local shelters and the homeless serving system more broadly has made it challenging to ensure consistency in how the standardized assessment tools are understood and administered. Our inquiry suggests that the greatest failures associated with the use of the common assessment tool happened when service providers assume that the tool produces an objective and timeless assessment of a person's housing and support needs, displacing the insights of the person seeking housing, as well as those offered by workers with whom they have relationships. As a service provider named Kate explained, if you and I did a SPDAT right now, or did some mental health screening based on our frame of mind right now, we would score in a certain way. If something stressful happened tomorrow morning and I redid the test, I would score in a different way, right? That's the whole idea of an assessment, is that it's a point in time. The focus on standardized assessment as a key piece to the solution to homelessness implies that service provider decision-making, subjectivity, and bias undermine the efficacy and fairness of a functioning housing and homelessness system, and assumes that professional knowledge and judgment are problems rather than assets to be cultivated alongside the use of clinical tools. Research consistently identifies poverty, housing availability, and affordability as the primary drivers of homelessness across the global north. Chronic homelessness is the result of resource deficits with the public system and a lack of affordable housing. While it's easier to support someone's tenancy with a fulsome understanding of the range of factors that might undermine it, homelessness is not simply a failure on the parts of service providers to know their clients. It results when our society prioritizes the commodification of housing over people's human rights, and when our public systems fail to comprise an adequate social safety net. The people who we interviewed also expressed a concern that the standardized assessment tool is not trauma-informed. It can be distressing for those who receive it and those who administer it to others. One service provider we spoke to offered a sharp critique of the tool and the challenges she faces when administering it to clients. I think it's a horrific program that I have no choice but to utilize, to sit down with an individual who is currently in crisis and survival mode, asking them about sex work, substance abuse, mental health, family issues, as a person who maybe doesn't know them that well. In fact, I for sure don't know them that well because it's part of our intake process. The third stage is prioritization. Our research found that the prioritization process is undermined by the reliability of the vulnerability assessment results and a lack of suitable housing options. Service providers described the prioritization process as unreflective of the needs that they were seeing. Our research revealed several ways in which the prioritization process is a complex political, economic, social, and psychological undertaking, and not simply a technical one. For example, contrary to the idea expressed by some service providers that some people on the by name list don't want housing, we found that the housing being offered might be unsuitable to their needs. Sometimes people turn down an offer of housing not because they're being choosy, but because they know what they need to feel safe. Others that we spoke to have yet to be offered any housing at all, though they are participating actively and knowledgeably in the coordinated access process. Tiffany identifies as Indigenous and Two-Spirit. She and her partner have been homeless and on the by name list for the past year. Tiffany was homeless for the first time 14 years ago as she exited the child welfare system. And today she is a peer support worker with a local organization. But she was still living outside at the time of her interview because she's no longer able to find a place she can afford to rent. She won't use the shelter system because she wants to remain with her partner. And she's not been able to secure housing through the by name list. She said, "We're not being offered any places. We do our SPDAT every 3 months. I'm thinking, what if maybe they're not even entering our updated scores? They don't tell you what number you are on the list." The last stage is matching and referral. Coordinated access is framed as an evidence-led process for ensuring that people without housing are matched with housing resources that suit their needs. But our research found that there are fewer housing resources for people experiencing multiple barriers to housing stability than are needed in our community. There simply are not sufficient resources available to the highest acuity individuals in our community, nor are the resources offered always suitable nor desirable for people who need them. There are also far fewer affordable units than there are people in core housing need, placing people at risk of episodic homelessness and increasing the risk of chronic homelessness for anyone who becomes homeless in this rental market. Resource scarcity undermines the matching and referral process and prevents service providers from being able to use our local prioritization matrix to ensure that people who are most vulnerable to homelessness get prioritized for housing support. As such, the process set up to advance the right to housing by fostering fairness in the face of resource scarcity is still not housing the people determined to need it most. As part of our study, we reached out to the City of Peterborough requesting up-to-date data on how people are moving through the coordinated access system. We learned that fewer than 5% of the 1,008 people who are on Peterborough's by name list in 2022 were offered housing through coordinated access that year. However, 311 people moved from homelessness to housing. So the vast majority of people were moving into housing. The vast majority of people were moving into housing through mechanisms outside of coordinated access. This was almost 7 times the number who shifted to housing through coordinated access. So just have a few final thoughts for you. The first regards the human touch. The human-centered aspects of social service work remain essential to enabling stable tenancies. Assessment, prioritization, matching, and referral is not simply a technical process enabled by the use of structured decision-making tools. It is a highly relational process requiring a commitment to flexibility, communication, and the self-determination of people in need. Housing and people's access to it is a social and political issue requiring social and political solutions. And secondly, housing as a human right. Coordinated access rests on the assumption that the central problem in homelessness-serving sectors is a lack of structured decision-making and coordination of services, rather than a lack of appropriate housing and social and healthcare support for individuals and families in need. the housing crisis in Canada is a result of the prioritization of private property ownership at the expense of continued investments in publicly owned housing stock and the right to housing. It's exacerbated by the intensification of the financialization of housing and private property. In this context, where land and shelter are seen as private commodities, instead of the collective resources that we all require to live, thrive, and participate in our communities. So I'll leave you with a few recommendations. First, I would encourage you to do studies like this one, to take the pulse of how responses to homelessness are working or not working in your community. In our context, the research has led to knowledge being mobilized through zines, presentations, reports, and media and academic articles, as well as data poems. But more than knowledge transfer, it has built relationships, allowing us to get to know our community as people felt heard and validated, built trust, and sought out what we have learned. In May, we were able to co-host a housing and homelessness forum that brought together 75 service providers, city staff, people with lived experience, and other community members, together to learn about what we had heard, to weigh in on it, and to begin to identify goals, actors, steps, and strategies. What we heard back is that attendees wanted more time to continue this conversation. So we're planning a second 2-day action-focused forum to provide that opportunity. Last year, our city had no winter plan to support people living outside. And as we have learned, shelters are not accessible to many in our community. This year, the city has closed its overflow shelter, is using it for support services, and is setting up 50 modular homes. At the same time, the city and community organizations are coming together to open up a daytime drop-in and winter overnight drop-in center. The city is committing $900,000 a year over 3 years for its first multi-year winter strategy of this kind. The community is approaching homelessness differently and drawing on what we've learned to do so. So we would recommend that communities find ways to do the research, to find out how people are managing with current responses to homelessness, to build relationships with community members, and to bring people together across sectors and circumstances, to learn from each other and to work together to strategize to reduce homelessness and its harms. And I'd like to thank Shirk and Reaching Home for their support. Thank you.
Well done. You were 53 seconds under time, which I really appreciate. That makes my job easier.
Thank you. Whew, tough act to follow. Can you guys even see me over the computer? Perfect. All right. Well, good afternoon. I've probably rewritten this presentation 3 times in the last 24 hours, trying to imagine how best to present this work to such a distinguished room. Cumulatively, probably here, there are hundreds of years of experience in addressing homelessness. Some of you will have roots deeply embedded in frontline work, and others will be more broadly connected through advocacy or governance work. Some of you will have lived and living experience. Each of you has a unique perspective on who is addressing homelessness in your community. As I introduce my topic today, I'm going to ask you to indulge me. If possible, I want you to pull out a piece of paper and a pen. I know some of you won't be familiar with those tools anymore, but you could use your phone to create a memo. And over the next few slides as I talk, I want you to draw me a picture or a map or make a list of everyone who's addressing homelessness in your community. And don't worry about how it looks. There's no judgment here, and there are no bonus points for the prettiest map. Okay. So while you do that, let me introduce myself. I'm Carrie. And my connection to addressing homelessness comes from working with organizations and communities who are doing the hard work of tackling a social issue that is complex, wicked, and a result of expanding issues related to poverty, social inequity, and systemic racism. I live in Kelowna, BC, a city one prominent politician this summer compared to a third world country. The pictures he tweeted were my neighborhood, just a couple short blocks from my home for the last 20 years. Within a 15-minute of where I live, a walking distance, by the way, there are 2 large shelters, a supportive housing unit, an outdoor sheltering encampment, which housed over 100 people this last year, and as of January, will also be home to 60 tiny homes. When I talked with my neighbors about the work I do with organizations in our community, there are mixed reactions. Each conversation is colored by the experiences and the knowledge, sometimes limited, sometimes not, of the complex reasons people become, remain, or exit homelessness. Each conversation is colored by the lens of what we know. So too are the maps you're drawing. I hope you're drawing maps right now. I can see some people drawing. Oh, look, there's one. Good. The work I'm going to share with you is part of a larger thesis project for my PhD. Well, I've been working in academia for 20 years as a professor and most recently as an administrator in the system. I'm really a late career academic and researcher. My entry into academia was from a practitioner role. I work with organizations to understand their environments, to help them plan for and adjust to change. And my job quite often is to help organizations to step back from their day-to-day and consider the world around them. So I've been doing research in and around homelessness for about 10 years, and 2 things kind of struck me that have propelled me to this research project. And one is that in previous work, we learned that not everybody who's providing housing or works in the housing continuum sees themselves addressing homelessness. So I want you to think about that for a moment. And the second thing is that there are systems of supports that people rely on, but those systems don't always work in tandem. And I think Marianne's presentation already highlighted that fantastically for me. So the more I learned and worked in community, the more I was attracted to understanding how we address homelessness, not just at the level of service provision and the supports that are on the streets, but more broadly as a collection of systems and supports, and how they work together to support individuals at risk or experiencing homelessness. So I'm going to try to describe for you in the next few minutes what that field view is, which is what my research is really about, and how a field view could possibly work to change how we're addressing critical social issues. So I'm hoping to leave you with a mini experience of my research. That's where your map's going to come into play. A model for creating a field view in your community, an example of a map that I've created for Kelowna, and an overview of how this field view could change how we address homelessness. So if you're comfortable and able, I want you to take just a moment to share your map with a person close to you. Don't worry if they're not from the same community. This is in my classroom. This is the participatory part of the lecture. Okay. While you're doing that, I want you to notice a few things. What do your maps have in common? How are they different? And how did other people's approach differ from yours? Does anybody want to share anything that they learned when they looked at someone else's map? Yeah?
I didn't draw anything from Toronto, and I used to co-chair the housing and homelessness.
So you're traumatized?
So I can't draw it.
You can't draw it. You can't draw it. Okay, that's an excellent answer. What a great segue. What I hope you would have found had you been able to share and participated in this is that nobody's maps look the same, and that they were all coming from a specific perspective, that your view is a slice of the overall picture. And by putting your view together with someone else's view and someone else's view, we start to create a more complete picture of who's involved. And that's a little example of how my study was built. So people in my study came from a variety of backgrounds. They came from all over: health, community safety, service provision, housing, and they were all in leadership positions. So we would expect them to have a sort of a higher level view of what was going on, and they all had connections to homelessness. Oops, sorry, I'm gonna go back. And I'm gonna speed up, I think. When I'm thinking about a systems view, they're usually focused on one particular area. So, and they come with their own specific lenses. So if we think about what some of those different systems might be, it could be health, it could be criminal justice, it could be related to enforcement or mental health. And all of those systems were designed to address one specific problem, usually, or a very niche set of problems. And usually those things are outside of homelessness. So an example might be healthcare. And so that system evolved to address critical health issues and to address them in the shortest time possible in an effective and efficient manner. When people experiencing homelessness engage with the healthcare system, they're often treated and then released as if the support that the housed people have will be available to individuals experiencing homelessness as well, which is not necessarily the case, and it's not necessarily very good healthcare. And this disconnect creates a gap in service provision for individuals. So when we approach situations like homelessness from a single system or a limited systems view, we develop solutions that tend to be limited or narrow to a set of solutions and might not result in collaborative or integrated approaches. So a field view is at a higher level. This is a view created when we pull multiple individual maps together. And for those of us that arrived on a plane, a great example is to consider how different the land looks when you're flying in the middle of your flight versus when you're landing or taking off. So this field view gives us an aerial perspective of multiple systems and the players engaged in addressing homelessness. So we can see more fully how things are interconnected or where there might be gaps. So this is my model. And I'm going to try to describe 2 years of work to you in 2 minutes. So we're going to start with what looks like a target. So at the center of that target are organizations or entities that are placed at the core or at the heart of the issue. So these are organizations that are providing services and supports that are directly connected to those that are most at risk or who are experiencing homelessness. So that could be outreach workers and teams, lived experience groups. In Kelowna, that's groups like Can Do, our Kelowna area network for drug users, our lived experience circle on homelessness. It could be shelter providers, etc. Emergency personnel. These entities provide those core emergency services and are often what the general public identifies as critical organizations addressing homelessness. The second ring is a supportive or a secondary ring. Once individuals have connected with services, we move them to the next ring in the model. So these organizations or entities are engaged in activities that further support people to secure or maintain their housing. So this might be examples of supportive housing providers, primary health care providers, mental health supports, and they work to stabilize and wrap around the necessary supports to help people move to a position of stability. The third ring is related to entities that are further involved in supporting individuals to maintain or gain that stable position. And this ring specifically would include groups that provide supports that are less directly connected to homelessness and more directly connected to the prevention or maintenance of homelessness or the maintenance of housing. So for the purposes of this model, we're really describing organizations that are upstream or downstream of homelessness. So this could be a host of nonprofit organizations, dentists, other healthcare professionals, schools, post-secondary training organizations, and these can also be instrumental organizations in providing research or data for decision-making in the field. And then the final ring is related to policy and funding. So this ring is the furthest from the issue, and it evolved because of commentary in my study where people talked about those creating policies or providing funding are the furthest removed from the issue and the furthest removed from the people at the center of the model. It's not to say they're not important, but that they're further removed. And so this could include governments and other key funders such as foundations or trusts. And then finally are the petals. So those are the pretty colored little petals in the middle of this model. And they represent different systems or sectors that work to address homelessness. And while this model shows that they're all intersecting at the middle, that's just because it makes it pretty. But in reality, that's likely not the case. You won't see everybody, every system or sector connecting at the center. So really what I did was I created a situation just like you were. I sat people down and I said, please draw me a map. I videotaped them drawing a map, and while they did that, I asked them questions. And essentially, I had them tell me stories about why individual organizations were placed, their relationship to others, and why other organizations weren't there. And I tagged every individual organization mentioned, I coded, I compiled the stories, and what resulted was the model that I just presented, as well as a map for Kelowna. So here's some examples of the maps I got from people. So this person took a very person-centered approach to mapping. That was also a map. Good thing I videotaped that one, or I would never have understood what the map said. And more structured maps. To all in the service of creating this, which was the map I created for Kelowna. So that's a draft map. It'll get cleaned up a little bit as I work with community to refine that. There's over 200 entities represented in that map and over 23 systems or sectors that are identified. So what are some first thoughts when you see that? I actually had someone else say that in my, yay! Any other thoughts? It is complex. That was almost the first thing that everybody mentioned. And it was something that resonated with participants in that they're always trying to describe why this is such a difficult issue to solve. And this map helps to show the complexity in a very visceral, ugly sort of way, which is why I love it. So I hope that my work always has impact in the community. So that was one of the questions that my thesis is asking. So does that pretty picture actually help do anything? And we think that it might. We think that it can help support people who have lived or living experience of homelessness in that it can create a very graphical representation of who they could connect with, or whoever is supporting them could figure out who they could connect with. But it also puts people, individuals at the center, and not all systems maps do. For people that are working within the sector, individuals, it can give you an idea of who else you can reach out to. That may not always be obvious. For organizations, it can help to identify people within your system or sector that you may not be aware of, as well as upstream or downstream in your system or sector. And it can help to identify people outside of your system that could be useful. And that's what also supports system work as well, is that you can see where your system may be overlapping or where organizations within your system or sector are overlapping and working within other systems or sectors. So it can help us to identify those gaps. It can help us to identify where there actually is necessary duplication, and it can help us to justify that sometimes. From a field view, what it does is it can help us to see where our investment is. So if we want to speak the language of the business world or of government, we can see where we're investing our time and resources. So you could actually start to map things like the resources that are required in each of those different rings, or can see if there's a consolidation or one area that's getting more funding than others that might be causing problems. And then I think that it has potential for use in communities. So in particular, I tend to work with, well, Kelowna is not a small community. I do work with surrounding communities around there. And for smaller communities, this ability to bring people together and map creates an opportunity for community conversation. And I gotta tell you, some of those hardest conversations that we have in community are really related to who's doing what, who should be doing what, who's not doing what. And so a map like this, having organizations self-declare where they sit on that map and how they interrelate with other people, can change the narrative around the kinds of collaborative planning that you're doing. And in one community, it's actually helped us to be able to say, where are we going to put our resources? So maps like this can just change the way that we think about who's involved, who's not involved, and who should we be bringing to the table. I think one of the interesting things for me that I've taken away from talking with other community members and with my participants when they're looking at this map is how many organizations they weren't aware of, and how many organizations would not themselves likely be placing themselves onto a map like this. So the SPCA might not necessarily think that they should be on that map, but they were. Media outlets might not think that they should be on this map, but they were. The coroner, many people wouldn't put the coroner necessarily within who's addressing homelessness, but they're a key supplier of data. And so it brings awareness to the totality of who is involved and who might also have responsibility. So my hope is that this can help communities to unlock resources that might be available to them that they might not be thinking of. So in terms of future directions, I want to continue to validate whether or not this model's a thing. So if you think it's a thing, connect with me after, because that would be really reassuring. I'd like to identify some other test communities that might want to trial having a community conversation and creating a community map. Eventually, I want to do a mapping toolkit if this does prove to be a thing. And eventually, I also have to finish my PhD somewhere in there. So that's sort of future directions for where I'm headed. I have created the cardinal sin of not putting a slide at the end with my contact details, but that also forces you to connect with me. So I do have cards, and I can give you contact information if you're interested.
Thank you. You were 2 minutes and 54 seconds under. Y'all are not letting me utilize my strengths here. No. I'll move that for you.
I'm like a child. I just leave things everywhere.
So I get an extra 5 minutes, do I? No, I'm between you and the end of today. So it's my absolute pleasure to be here with you today and to share some of the findings of a research study that I led, along with some of my colleagues from Ontario Tech University. And the research essentially evaluated a couple of pilot community hubs that were created in Durham region, which is in Ontario, during the pandemic. And I will get into it. So at the height of the pandemic, within the regional municipality of Durham, I'm very sure many of you are aware in your own communities that there are a lot of closures of community services. As a result of that, individuals experiencing homelessness and other vulnerabilities, they lost access to healthcare services, housing, social services, lost access to meal programs, washroom facilities, as well as refuge from the heat and the cold. So in light of that, community organizations within Durham, as well as advocacy group that were engaged in conversations around homelessness and advocacy around homelessness, kind of teamed together with the municipal government. And what they came up with was the creation of a couple of pilot community hubs that were developed and up and running within 2 weeks. And so the region felt that now we have invested in these community hubs and they've gotten started in 2020, and they wanted to know, were these hubs responsive and effective in addressing the needs of the patrons who were mainly, over 80% of them were homeless, were accessing these services. And so they put a call for proposal out to the institutions. I responded to it, and it was accepted. And I, with my supervisor and a couple of other students, we actually did an evaluation of the program. So in terms of the methodology, I won't go over the entire slides because it only have 20 minutes. And so the study design, for me having a background in working in supportive housing and with individuals experiencing homelessness, I do believe and I'm 100% committed to the mantra, nothing for us without us. And so the first order of business was to convene an advisory committee comprising of patrons from the community hubs, employees, and some other social service workers within the region of Durham. The committee met for a year and were involved, working alongside the research team, involved in creating or co-designing all aspects of the research, including the recruitment, data collection, analysis, as well as providing some input in the reports of the findings. We use a mixed methods approach because we wanted to make sure that we are collecting as much, we wanted to make sure that we're collecting some deep data. And so what we did with the surveys, we had some open-ended questions, or mainly open-ended questions, but we also had some closed-ended questions. They were mainly closed-ended questions, and we had some open-ended questions. In addition to that, we did semi-structured interview with some of the key informants. Across the two community hubs, we surveyed 75 patrons. There were 35 from one hub and 40 from the other hub. There were 15 staff members that participated, 5 from one hub, 10 from the other hub, and 5 managers across the two community hubs. In terms of the subject matter experts, there were 2 individuals who were working with one of the community hubs. One individual was focused on the issue of anti-human trafficking, and I was just flabbergasted to know that within homelessness, there's a lot of human trafficking that takes place. In addition to that, the other subject matter expert is a person with lived experience who leads an advocacy group within the community. So in terms of data collection, we first look at the literature, local, national, international literature on co-located services for individual experiencing homelessness. And I said before, we surveyed 75 patrons. What we did, the research assistants, they went to the community hubs, they became familiar with the patrons, familiar with the staff. And so the day of the recruitment was the same day that they actually administered paper copy surveys. And as you work with the homeless population, you know that they're very transient. People don't have time to keep appointments, a way of tracking appointments. So we caught them where we could. And the employees, they completed online surveys, self-administered through SurveyMonkeys. And I interviewed the 7 key informants and managers through a virtual Zoom meeting. So with regards to the data analysis, the quantitative data, we analyzed the data using a software that's called SPSS. We looked at percentage, we looked at average, and we also looked at ranking. And in terms of the thematic analysis, we use a model that's called Braun and Clark. And what it did, we kind of grouped together similar statements and ideas. And from there, we had some of the sub-themes emerging, and then we grouped the sub-themes to get the major themes. So from the literature review, what we found was there's limited information on community hubs that co-locate healthcare and behavioral services for populations experiencing homelessness. We also identified that there is an urgent need for this kind of service, not only locally, nationally, but internationally as well. And that these services need to be low barrier access. They need to be available, throughout the week, any time of the day for populations that are vulnerable. We found that there were some benefits to having these service models. For example, they improve the mental health, the physical health, as well as the quality of life of the individuals. And that happened because these staff members working within the community hubs, combining healthcare and social services, they were able to coordinate their services very effectively and efficiently. They didn't have to deal with long wait lists. They were able to talk to each other because they're in the same space and seamlessly move the participants or the patrons through the system of care that was much more cost effective than the traditional model of service. In addition to that, what we learned from the literature was that having these co-located services also reduce stigma in service delivery. And that was something that we heard from the patrons that we surveyed as well, that some of them felt so stigmatized walking into an organization that provided, say, mental health services alone or addiction services. So going into a community hub where there are multiple services, no one watching knows what services they're going to be accessing there. And in terms of some of the barriers that were identified in the literature, there's a lack of tools and resources to support communities to develop and operate community hubs. We also found that we are all very busy in the work that we do, especially in homeless services with a lack of resources and the laundry list of everything that we had to do. And so it was very difficult for individuals to find the time to get together to do this kind of work. And lastly, in terms of integrating primary care into existing structure, that was something that the literature was found to be very challenging for organizations. So just turning our attention to some of the data from the findings. Here we have some of the demographic data from the patrons. And it's not surprising that the majority of the patrons identified as males. Over 70% is similar to the data that exists nationally, and that over 20% identified as female. We also had 1.3% that identified as transgender and two-spirited, and 1.3% decided not to respond. So with regards to the age group that were served, it was between 18 to over 65 years of age. And as we looked more intimately at the data, for the two community hubs, what we found in Community Hub 1 was the majority of individuals noted that they were between the ages of 25 and 34 years old. And for Community Hub 2, it was individuals between the ages of 55 and 64 years old. And this has implications for the services that are delivered to these individuals. For those that are older, their service requirements will be different than for those that are younger. So in terms of the staff members, as I noted previously, there were 15 staff members who participated in the study. And these are some of the services that they provided, are the areas that they worked in. Income and employment, for example, there were 4 out of the 15 that worked in income and employment. In mental health and addiction counseling, there were 6 of the 15 staff that worked in that area. But I should say that some of the staff also had multiple roles, which is very common in the work that we do. In terms of harm reduction, there were 3 staff out of the 15 who identified. But we also identified a couple of unique services that were offered by each community hub. Hub 1, which is the blue, for example, had 2 peer support workers that were not present in Hub 2. And Hub 2 had 3 nurse practitioners that on site that were not present in Hub 1. So we asked patrons to identify their main areas of needs, to rank these out of 9, with 9 means the highest area of needs and 1 means the lowest. And so just looking at the gray lines, those are the aggregate data across the 2 community hubs. And that what we found here was that 72% of the patrons, the patrons ranked addiction as their highest area of need at 7.2, and they also ranked the high cost of housing and limited housing stock as 7.1. Concurrent disorders, lack of income, and mental health challenges were ranked as 6.7 across the 2 community hubs. In terms of housing access barriers, we found that the patrons identified that addiction was ranked the highest at 7.2 as the barrier, followed by the high cost of rent. In looking more intimately at the data for individual hubs, we found that for Hub 1, they ranked lack of income as 9.2 as a barrier, as well as the high cost of housing ranked as 8.2 as a barrier to accessing housing. So if we turn our attention to the healthcare needs of the patrons, they were asked to rank the prevalence of their health concerns from 1 to 6, with 1 being the most prevalent and 6 being the least prevalent. And so if we look at the top line there, at hub number 2, we see that they ranked mental health issue as the most prevalent at 2.7, was ranked by 62% of the patrons. And for Hub 1, they ranked chronic physical health issues, 1.7 by 57% of the patrons as their highest areas of need. Overall, mental health was ranked as the most prevalent, and the least prevalent was cognitive or neurological brain injuries across the 2 community hubs. So in terms of the community hubs' responses to the patrons' health needs, what I should say that for the community hubs, in designing these hubs, Community Hub 2 has 3 nurse practitioners on site. They also have a team of physicians that volunteer and on a rotational basis at the hub, while for Hub 1, they didn't have space on site to have a co-located medical team, so what they did, they partnered with a primary care provider in the community. So looking at the data here, it's not surprising then that these patrons identified that 60% from Hub 1 noted that they have access to primary care, as well as 62% or 63% from Hub 2 that has a co-located primary care service on site. When we asked these patrons when was the last time they visited with a primary care provider, from Hub 1, 31% said more than 12 months ago, and those were the ones accessing primary care in the community, while those who were accessing primary care on site noted that the last time they met with a primary care provider was within the month. And the data here on emergency department visits, we know that individuals who are homeless, that's the default service for them. What we found here was that 41% had noted that within the last 6 months, they did not access emergency services. We heard from the community hub, the healthcare team on site, that they were diverting individuals from emergency department and that they were literally saving lives. There were times individuals overdosed on the street and they were brought into the community hub because of the healthcare services that are available. So in terms of patrons' overall experience, what we learned is that over 60% of the patrons either agree or strongly agree that the community hub helped them to access food at 68%, that helped them to address issues of social isolation at 67%, and that they were able to access other services in the community at 41%. And I should also really emphasize that the issue of social isolation was heightened during the time of the pandemic, when there were directives in place around social isolation and there was reduction in transportation services across the region. When we asked the employees in terms of their experiences with the community hubs, they were able to identify some achievements for patrons as well as the community hubs in general. They felt that patrons had increased access to housing. They were being placed on the housing waitlist, but we heard earlier about the challenges with getting people off the waitlist because there's a lack of housing. They were helping individuals to get IDs as well as helping them to access income, which were some of the resources that were required to help them to access housing. In terms of the community hubs, they felt that there was an expansion in the partnerships, not only within the co-locate services, but in the wider community. And as we learned from the community hubs, they triage, they actually do ongoing assessments of the needs that are required of the patrons, and they will bring in new services based on the demands, and they will scale back on services that were not required at particular time. So some of the challenges were around systemic barriers to housing, like the wait list, the high cost of rent, and just the limited housing stock that's available. In addition to that, the staff felt that there was a strong reliance on donations of food, clothing, pantry items, and both community hubs rely extensively on volunteers. One community hub has 60 volunteers, and some of the services cannot be provided if these volunteers are not available. Staff are very committed to their work. However, because of the high volume of work, just the complexity that they deal with, they felt at times that they were really physically and emotionally exhausted, and that management needed to take some of those factors into consideration. So with regards to I'm almost finished. With regards to the key informers, we asked them about what were some of the facilitators and barriers in terms of developing and operating the community hubs. So in terms of the facilitators, identified strong collaboration, local community support, strong leadership, clarity of vision, and transparent communication. So it's important to note that in terms of strong collaboration, These organizations and advocacy groups, they were working together prior to the pandemic and prior to the community hubs. They knew what the issues were. They knew what resources were required. However, the pandemic was the impetus that really got them to mobilize in a very, heightened way because of the severity of the situation that they experienced. Local support, we had a local church that donated space, a food kitchen that was available for one community hub. In addition to that, the municipal government also provided the other community hub space in 2 community centers. So with regards to barriers, the issue of funding is something that we're all aware of. Quarterly funding, precarious funding, inadequate funding impacts the ability to hire permanent staff, but also the long-term planning for the community hubs. Privacy legislation came up in terms of the coordination of care and informed consent. And so what one community hub did, they put a notice in the community hub for the patrons to say, if you're brought into the hub and you're not able to provide informed consent, we will use implied consent as partners, care partners in the circle of care to address to your needs. Limited space was another issue in terms of, not being able to bring some services on board. Furthermore, there was an issue around confidentiality and privacy. For example, during the pandemic, there was one community hub that had some clients that had virtual court hearings. So it was a bit of a challenge for them to have a private space to participate in those court hearings. And the one community hub experienced a lot of NIMBYism from the business leaders as well as some neighbors. So they're doing a lot of education with these communities. Recommendation, the first one off the top of the mind is adequate funding. Make sure that there's adequate ongoing core funding for these organizations. The next one is to establish a regional healthcare coordination, including the hospitals, community organization, and community hubs, so that care can be coordinated seamlessly across the healthcare system and with community services. Next one is for the municipality to identify housing access as a key strategic priority, and I know that they're engaged in various pieces of work around that. And the community hubs are, brand new, so one of the encouragement was for them to really ground the development of the community hub, their services, their practices, and the delivery of these services in empirical evidence and systems such or frameworks such as person-centered care, because this is their opportunity to get it right. And lastly, with the data that they have, to begin to develop some key performance indicators, some metrics, but also to commit some funding to tools to collect the data and to be able to do performance measurement, not only for the individual community hub, but for each hub, and to begin to establish some standards in terms of measurement for both community hubs. And lastly, in terms of the limitations, the findings, it was a one-time research. So the findings were self-reported. It was just at a particular time. It was during the pandemic, so there were some limitations around those pieces. And in addition to that, because most of the data that was collected was quantitative data, what we found was that there were some gaps in terms of the open-ended questions that really needed a bit more probing. So we encourage the community hubs, maybe in the future, to convene some focus groups or to do some interviews. That was something that we wanted to do, but we had a lot of restrictions during the pandemic. And in concluding, the research that we did provides data to help inform the following. The region, in terms of their strategic planning for vulnerable populations, for the community hubs to begin to develop some key performance indicators and some outcome metrics, and also for the region and the community hubs to determine if this model of service is effective and is the right model. And if it is, what are the elements that are needed to sustain them for the long term? And also, is it scalable to other communities? Thank you so much for your time.
So, Valletta, you went over by 2 minutes, which now means, unfortunately, everyone knows I'm all talk.
I stole her 2 last minutes.
I donated.
Okay. So now we'll open it up for questions. If you could please go to the mic and say your name and your organization. our colleagues and friends at home will be able to hear our questions. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you for these wonderful and informative presentations. My question is for Valletta. My name's Alzara. I am a PhD candidate as well at the University of Ottawa in the Population Health Department. And my question is around implied consent, which you mentioned. We know that privacy policies and information sharing policies are a huge barrier in coordinating services and coordinating healthcare, and a lot of my research focuses on that as well. So I was wondering if you can just elaborate a little bit more on how implied consent works, and how that might be chosen as an alternative if informed consent is not received. Thank you.
Okay, so this is within the context of the research. Can you hear me very well?
Get close to it.
I literally have to bite into it. So in terms of implied consent, because within the context of the community hubs, there are all these service providers that are working there, and so they're part of the circle of care. So that is the approach that they're taking, I believe, within the privacy legislation, within the circle of care. If you're not able to obtain informed consent and individuals are at high risk, for example, in the case of the community hubs, when individuals overdose and they're brought in, they can't give consent. And so what became critical, or what becomes critical, is about saving the life of the individual. And so one of their workarounds is to make sure that they create like a little notice and they paste it in the community hub for patrons as well as for some of the partners that are working there. Because there was a bit of hesitation on the part of some of the organizations that are working there. This individual is not able to sign a consent. We have privacy legislation and we don't want to put our organizations at risk. So the community hubs are continuously having conversations with their partners, these difficult conversations, and strategizing. If we were to have this scenario, what is the best workaround for some of those pieces?
Great. Erin.
Thank you. Thank you all for your presentation. My name's Erin Day. I'm at Wilfrid Laurier University. My question's also for Valletta. I'm not actually sure you're going to answer it, so I'm not trying to set you up here. Just out of curiosity, I'm just because you haven't done the qual, so maybe I'm just curious. 2 questions. I'm also double barreling it. It's all very unfair, but I'm doing it. My first question is, just having been at a session before the fire alarm about service restrictions, I'm wondering in a community hub model how that works if somebody's potentially restricted from one service. Could that affect their ability to access other services? So that's my one question. And then my second question is, I've been doing some research on that transitions from homelessness to housing and when people are housed, and I think that what I'm learning is that some folks really want to stay connected with their family, their built family, but some people want to be disconnected. Once they are housed, they don't want to be in those spaces anymore. And so I'm just thinking about ongoing care. If your health care is now attached to predominantly homeless serving space, how that might impact people once they become housed. So totally fair if that's not something you're able to answer at this time. Just wanted to throw those out there.
Again, within the context of the research, I will say in terms of service restriction, the organizations that participate in these community hubs, they have service agreements in place, and so no one is turned away. And so again, if someone comes in, what I learned is that most of the individuals that first approach the community hubs is around the food program. When they're there, they learn about other services. So it's, this whole system around the first door is the right door and should be the one door. So that's the approach that these community hubs take. So no one is turned away from any of the services that are there. And if the service is not available, then they refer them to the community. And because of this strong collaboration, both internally and externally, what the staff have found out, it was a lot easier to refer patrons out to the community, and that the community partners were a lot more responsive than they were previously prior to the community hubs being developed. So in terms of the transition, the second question was individuals that are transitioning into
Once they're housed.
Once they're housed.
Some folks kind of want to not be around a homeless community anymore.
So they continue to be around the community. And in addition to that, one of the factors that really helps the individuals to maintain housing is the ongoing follow-up support post-housing. So this is something that is built into the program. Unfortunately, there are only 2 housing workers, which was identified as a limitation. And there's so much need around housing. And so the staff do follow up with the clients who agree, because they recognize that these services that are being provided, whether it's healthcare, physical healthcare, mental health, counseling, etc., harm reduction supplies, that those are also some of the ingredients that help them to be not only successfully housed, but to maintain housing stability over time.
Carter.
Sorry, Aaron's a lot shorter than me. My name is Carter. I'm a graduate student at Carleton, and my question is for Mary Ann. So you talked a lot about kind of the challenges accessing the integrated care model in Peterborough, specifically with the shelters. Things like not wanting to be separated from a partner, or if you had like a cognitive disability or something like that. Are there other access points that I guess have, did you see a difference in the type of access point and the type of barriers that we're seeing, or was it pretty kind of standard across the board?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Carter. Can you hear me? Yeah, there are other access points. So at the time that we did the research, 5 of them were shelters and 5 were not shelters. And in those organizations, one was social services, one is the housing, I can't remember the name of it right now, but the housing resource center. And there were other organizations as well. Mostly what we heard were people expressing concerns around shelters. They weren't really speaking so much about other organizations, although there was a really mixed relationship that people had with social services. Part of that had to do with once people identified as being homeless, they knew that some of them knew that they ran the risk of losing the shelter portion of their social assistance checks. So it was really a little fraught reaching out to social services. Also because the city was involved in the enforcement of clearing encampments. So yeah, that was a really mixed kind of relationship. Yeah, but most of what we heard had to do with shelters.
Andrew? Is that not your name? Did I read that wrong?
No, you saw it all the way from here?
Yeah.
Good eyes. Hi, my name's Andrew Thornton. I work for the Nanaimo Systems Planning Organization. We're trying to do an impossible job like the rest of you. So I want to set a little context, but also primarily a question for Carrie, but I think it's relevant to everyone else on the panel. So in your model, and I'm previously an academic as well, so I know how people hold on, and it's like, how dare you criticize? It's not a criticism. It's I'm fascinated by the model and the ideas embedded in it. So there's theories of social space and social theories of space, and one of the dimensions of social space is time. So I'm wondering how time interacts or impacts or is a dimension of your model, and also for the other panelists as well. Clearly, time affects how and what is done when. So in the sense of, in particular, if you just think about a VAT or a VI SPDAT, if you do one of those, as soon as you do it, it's out of date. That's kind of research 101, right? You collect data, it becomes an artifact. But I'm not thinking of it that way, but in terms of how you then work with your data, and that's kind of what you're saying. But how do you do it on an ongoing basis? And you don't necessarily have to answer that right now. I'm happy to talk. But I'm really interested in Carrie's ideas around time.
Yeah, I'm going to geek out just a little bit, because one of the things I'm most excited about looking at a mapping model and creating a community map is the idea that you can see it change over time. And so it really can show for a community that if you're intentional about the activities that you're taking and the change that you want to see, doing successive maps using the same methodology, hopefully, and doing successive maps can actually document where you have made change. And can that be an opportunity for communities to demonstrate how far they have come? It can be difficult for us to create a quantitative metric for how we're addressing things or why a system is working better. But to show that you've closed gaps, or to show that you are reallocating resources in the way that you said you would. For example, if you have a community plan and you're trying to show that you have fidelity to that plan, successive snapshots of where you are in space and time can be really useful. So if you've got a framework that you can use as a backdrop to do that, you're really documenting change and progress in your community, or that's the opportunity anyway.
Thanks.
Brian?
You do have good eyesight. Those were 3 great papers, and one of the things I would love to do would be a fly in the wall as those 3 had a conversation amongst themselves. That would be really interesting. And the one question that might relate to all 3 was I noticed Valletta working on exactly how you were going to describe the people you were talking about. Patron, participant. At one point you said client, and then you almost corrected yourself and said patron. And Marianne, it seems to me that one of the heart of the critique of the coordinated access was it's all transactional. And it's almost a clientization of the people we're talking about, right? And then with Carrie, I loved that real simple, crazy picture with the stick person, because there's a person. And when I look at your map, I think, where the hell can a person find themselves in this map, and how do you navigate with that kind of a map, because that's what maps are for. So that's just sort of, it's mostly a question of how do we talk about the folks that we're talking about?
I think one of the things that I'm most fascinated about, and I tend to look at things from a big picture perspective, is that we have difficulty when we're creating maps that are related to systems, or in my case, a field. We have difficulty locating the individual, and I think that's what in the approach that I'm taking, I'm trying to centralize the person at the core of the map. In ways that, and some of the participants said when they saw the map, so I had them draw their maps, then I showed them my map that was a cumulative of everybody's map, and that's one of the comments that they brought out, is that you could see, an individual could see how they could progress through a system, and they could see the different rings, they could identify progress, they could see different opportunities that it would work for service providers as well. But just centralizing it, when we look at community hubs and other models where the focus is not on the system, the focus is on the people and how the system serves the people. So there's that decolonization of the systems in service of how we support an individual to move from where they are to where they'd like to be. So not making any judgments there, just offering those opportunities.
So thank you for raising that, Brian, in terms of identifiers and how we use these identifiers. So the community hubs, and that was something that at the outset we kind of struggled with, because they don't refer to your service users as clients, they refer to them as patrons. Within the context of research, you want to talk about the participants, but when you think about the hub as a whole, they are patrons, even those that didn't participate, but benefited from these services. And within the context of the literature review, they speak of those individuals as clients as opposed to patrons. So that's why there was a kind of interchange of using that, which I struggle with sometimes, and again, my background is in social work. We talk about the clients, that's language that I've been shifting away from over the years. And to be respectful of individuals, also, how would they like to be identified? So within our sector, I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done on identifiers, how individuals like to identify themselves, and for us to be respectful of those identifiers.
Marianne, do you want to speak?
Yeah, in our research, we've been using the terms service user and service provider, which I recognize are problematic in themselves. And part of that has to do with the binary that creates between two different groups of people. And what we know in our community and in many is that these are not mutually exclusive groups, that there's a lot of overlap between them. We really recognize the importance of situating people at the heart, but also in relationship, and in relationship to each other, in relationship to the services that they're experiencing. So I really appreciate your comment, and I think it's an ongoing challenge. I'm not sure how many of you were next door at the PATH talk just before this one, but the term, path walkers was used to incorporate both people who are needing housing and people who are supporting them in that journey. And I really like that term, and I would really like to explore it a little bit further. Thanks.
Claire?
Thanks so much. Good eye. Can you hear me? Yeah. 3 excellent presentations and great perspectives. My question is for Valletta. She's getting lots of them. I'm with the Catherine Donnelly Foundation, so we're a national funder of including around affordable housing solutions. But I spent 2 decades working in community and in Regent Park for a decade in Toronto, which is Canada's oldest and largest social housing community. And I was thinking a little bit about the community hub model that emerged in Durham post-pandemic, and I was thinking a little bit about community health centers, which in some cities, including Toronto and I think Ottawa as well, there are some of them that have been designed as community hubs to be multi-service, to work with other service providers, to be really creative around, how to engage with folks in a multi-service way. And so I just wondered what your reflections were, because there are some of those models. Some have worked well, others not so much. But it strikes me, in anyone who's worked in community, and Brian was asking the question about language, we used to use the term community members because, we're all in it together. Hubs are, so powerful because they destigmatize, because people can move into leadership roles in them. You can get all those services. And I'm just curious about how you've thought about sort of CHCs, community health centers, as one piece of that puzzle. And I was meeting with another funder this week, a very significant funder. We were talking a little bit about housing solutions, and both agreeing that we'd love to see more community hubs on the main floor of affordable housing projects. We've seen lots of those. They work really well. People are integrated well. So I'd just love to hear your reflections a bit on that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great question, and that was something that we reflected on, in terms of the research. The CHCs that I'm familiar with that you're speaking about, they serve more like the general population. And so the community hubs that were developed, they were geared mainly towards individuals who are experiencing homelessness. And so just looking at the literature, that was a significant gap that was identified. But there was also a tremendous need that was identified for these hubs to really kind of be focused more closely on individuals that are experiencing homelessness.
Thank you.
Okay, great. It looks like we're all done here. Thank you so much to all 3 of you.